The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Marcus Whitfield adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the sea of eager faces before him. What happened next would destroy a 30-year academic career in a matter of minutes, and expose the ugly truth about privilege and prejudice in America's most prestigious institutions. But here's what this arrogant professor didn't know. The young black student he was about to humiliate in front of 200 classmates had a father who could end his career with a single phone call, and that's exactly what was about to happen. If you've ever witnessed injustice or seen someone get the comeuppance they deserved, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story will leave you speechless and prove that karma has perfect timing. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Harvard University's most prestigious lecture hall, casting long shadows across the mahogany-paneled walls lined with portraits of distinguished alumni. The air was thick with the scent of old books and fresh coffee as students filed into their seats, their conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. This was advanced economic theory, taught by the infamous Professor Marcus Whitfield, a man whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by his notorious arrogance and thinly veiled prejudices. Professor Whitfield stood at the front of the room like a king surveying his domain. At 58, he cut an imposing figure with his perfectly pressed tweed jacket, crisp white shirt, and the kind of condescending smile that suggested he believed himself intellectually superior to everyone around him. His salt and pepper hair was meticulously styled, and his expensive Italian leather shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He had been teaching at Harvard for 3 decades, and his sense of entitlement had grown with each passing year. Among the 200 students filling the tiered seating was Marcus Johnson, a 20-year-old economics major whose quiet confidence and sharp intellect had already caught the attention of several professors. Marcus sat in the 3rd row, his notebook open and pen ready, dressed in a simple navy sweater and jeans that spoke to his practical nature rather than any attempt to impress. His dark eyes held an intensity that suggested deep thought, and there was something about his posture that conveyed both respect for education and an unwillingness to be intimidated by authority. What Professor Whitfield didn't know, what none of the students knew, was that Marcus Johnson was the son of David Johnson, the tech billionaire whose foundation had donated over $50 million to Harvard University in the past 5 years. David Johnson's contributions had funded new research facilities, scholarships for underprivileged students, and the very lecture hall where his son now sat. But Marcus had specifically requested that his father's identity remain confidential, wanting to succeed on his own merits rather than riding on his family's wealth and influence. Professor Whitfield began his lecture with his usual theatrical flair, pacing across the front of the room like a performer on stage. Today, we'll be discussing the economic theories that have shaped modern capitalism, he announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no disagreement. These are complex concepts that require sophisticated thinking, something that unfortunately seems to be in short supply among today's students. The insult was delivered with such casual cruelty that several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was vintage Whitfield, the man who believed that education was a privilege reserved for those he deemed worthy, and who had made a career of crushing the spirits of students who didn't fit his narrow definition of academic excellence. As the lecture progressed, Professor Whitfield outlined various economic models, his explanations peppered with subtle digs at students who had previously challenged his views. He seemed to take particular pleasure in dismissing ideas that came from minority students, often couching his rejections in language that sounded academic, but carried unmistakable undertones of bias. The problem with modern economic discourse, he continued, adjusting his glasses with theatrical precision, is that everyone thinks they have something valuable to contribute. But true economic insight requires breeding, education, and a certain cultural sophistication that simply cannot be taught. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had encountered professors like Whitfield before, men who used their positions of power to perpetuate systems of exclusion and discrimination. But Marcus had also learned that the best way to challenge such attitudes was through excellence, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to truth. About halfway through the lecture, Professor Whitfield opened the floor for questions and discussion. "Now then," he said with a smirk that suggested he expected nothing but mediocrity, "does anyone have any thoughts on the material we've covered? Any insights you'd like to share?" Several hands went up around the room, but Professor Whitfield's eyes seemed to deliberately skip over certain students, particularly those who didn't fit his preferred demographic. When his gaze finally landed on Marcus, who had raised his hand with quiet confidence, something shifted in the professor's expression. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes, a slight curl of his lip that suggested distaste. "Yes," Professor Whitfield said, his tone already dismissive. "Mr. Johnson, isn't it? What profound wisdom do you have to share with us today?" The sarcasm was so thick it was almost visible, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the lecture hall. Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He had prepared for this moment, not knowing it would come today, but understanding that eventually he would need to prove himself in an environment designed to diminish him. "Professor Whitfield," Marcus began, his voice clear and steady, "I'd like to discuss the limitations of the Chicago school economic model you've been presenting as gospel. Specifically, how its assumptions about rational market behavior fail to account for systemic inequalities and historical injustices that continue to shape economic outcomes today." The lecture hall fell silent. This wasn't the kind of superficial question Professor Whitfield was expecting. This was a direct challenge to the theoretical framework he had been promoting, delivered with the kind of intellectual sophistication that demanded a serious response. But instead of engaging with the substance of Marcus's question, Professor Whitfield's face twisted into an expression of barely concealed contempt. "Oh, how refreshing," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Another student who thinks they can solve centuries of economic theory with trendy social justice rhetoric. Tell me, Mr. Johnson, did you learn these talking points from some diversity workshop, or did you pick them up from whatever community college you transferred from?" The insult hit the lecture hall like a physical blow. Students gasped audibly, and several shifted in their seats with obvious discomfort. The attack was so blatantly inappropriate, so clearly motivated by racial bias, that even Professor Whitfield's usual supporters seemed taken aback. Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation and anger, but he had learned long ago not to let such emotions control his response. Instead, he remained standing, his expression calm, but his eyes blazing with intelligence and determination. "Actually, and Professor," Marcus replied, his voice remaining steady despite the provocation, "I'm a Harvard student, just like everyone else in this room. And my question wasn't rhetoric. It was based on extensive research into the empirical failures of neoclassical economic models when applied to real-world scenarios involving historical discrimination and ongoing systemic barriers." Professor Whitfield's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment at being corrected or anger at being challenged by someone he clearly considered beneath him. "Research?" he scoffed, his voice rising slightly. "What research could you possibly have done that would qualify you to critique economic theories developed by Nobel Prize winners? Do you think your perspective somehow gives you special insight into complex economic systems?" The emphasis on the word perspective was loaded with meaning, and everyone in the room understood exactly what Professor Whitfield was implying. He was suggesting that Marcus's race somehow disqualified him from serious academic discourse, that his identity was a limitation rather than a source of valuable insight. But Marcus had come prepared for exactly this kind of attack. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out a thick folder filled with research papers, data analysis, and economic projections. "As a matter of fact, Professor, I've spent the past 6 months conducting independent research on this exact topic. I've analyzed employment data, wage disparities, and investment patterns across different demographic groups, and the results clearly demonstrate the inadequacy of traditional economic models in explaining persistent wealth gaps." He began to outline his findings with the kind of precision and depth that would have impressed any serious academic. His research was thorough, his methodology sound, and his conclusions supported by extensive data analysis. As he spoke, other students began to lean forward in their seats, genuinely interested in what he was saying. But Professor Whitfield wasn't interested in the quality of Marcus's research. He was interested in maintaining his authority and putting this uppity student back in what he considered his proper place. "Enough," Professor Whitfield snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, Mr. Johnson, but this is my classroom, and I won't have it turned into some kind of political demonstration. Your so-called research is nothing more than activist propaganda dressed up in academic language." The attack was so vicious so clearly motivated by bias rather than any legitimate academic concern that several students began pulling out their phones to record the exchange. This was exactly the kind of incident that could destroy a professor's career in the age of social media. But Professor Whitfield was too blinded by his own arrogance to recognize the danger. Furthermore, he continued, his voice rising to a near shout, I find it highly suspicious that a student with your background would suddenly appear in my advanced course with such elaborate research. Did someone help you with this work? Because I find it very difficult to believe that you could produce this level of analysis on your own. The accusation of academic dishonesty was the final straw. The lecture hall erupted in shocked murmurs, and several students stood up in protest. The suggestion that Marcus couldn't possibly have done his own work because of his race was so blatantly discriminatory that even Professor Whitfield's most loyal supporters looked uncomfortable. Marcus felt something shift inside him. He had tried to handle this situation with dignity and professionalism, but Professor Whitfield had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The time for polite academic discourse had passed. Professor Whitfield, Marcus said, his voice now carrying a new edge of authority, I think you should be very careful about the accusations you're making. My research is entirely my own work, and I have extensive documentation to prove it. But more importantly, your behavior today has been completely inappropriate and potentially actionable. Professor Whitfield laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the silent lecture hall. Actionable? Are you threatening me, Mr. Johnson? Do you think you can intimidate me with legal threats? I've been teaching at this university longer than you've been alive, and I have tenure. There's nothing you or anyone else can do to touch me. The arrogance in his voice was breathtaking. Professor Whitfield genuinely believed that his position made him untouchable, that he could say and do whatever he wanted without consequences. He had no idea that he was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the limits of academic privilege. Can you imagine the shock that's about to unfold? This arrogant professor thinks he's untouchable, but he's about to discover that some students have more power than he ever imagined. What happens next will leave you speechless and prove that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. But before we continue with this incredible story, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a teacher or professor abuse their power like this? Share your experiences because your voice matters in exposing these injustices. Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. Professor Whitfield, he said calmly, I think there's something you should know about me before you continue with these accusations and insults. Oh, what's that? Professor Whitfield sneered. Are you going to tell me about your important connections, your influential family? Please, spare me the sob story about overcoming adversity. I've heard it all before. Marcus found the contact he was looking for and held up his phone so Professor Whitfield could see the screen. The name displayed was simple but devastating. Dad, David Johnson. For a moment, Professor Whitfield stared at the phone with confusion, not understanding the significance of what he was seeing. But then recognition began to dawn, and the color slowly drained from his face. That's right, Professor, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards. David Johnson is my father. You know, the David Johnson whose foundation has donated over $50 million to this university. The David Johnson who funded the construction of the very building we're sitting in right now. The lecture hall was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Students stared in shock, some pulling out their phones to Google the name David Johnson, others simply watching in fascination as their professor's world began to crumble before their eyes. Professor Whitfield's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The man who had been so eloquent in his cruelty just moments before was now speechless, his mind racing to process the implications of what he had just learned. But here's the thing, Professor, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. I specifically asked my father to keep my identity confidential because I wanted to succeed on my own merits. I didn't want special treatment or favoritism. I just wanted to be judged on the quality of my work and the strength of my ideas. Unfortunately, you've made that impossible. Marcus began walking down the steps toward the front of the lecture hall, his movement deliberate and purposeful. Other students turned in their seats to follow his progress, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. You see, Professor Whitfield, Marcus said as he reached the front of the room, my father didn't donate $50 million to Harvard so that professors like you could perpetuate the same systems of discrimination and exclusion that have plagued higher education for centuries. He donated that money because he believes in the power of education to transform lives and create opportunities for people regardless of their background. Professor Whitfield finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak croak. Marcus, Mr. Johnson, I had no idea. I mean, if I had known. If you had known what? Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp with anger.
If you had known that I was wealthy, you would have treated me with respect. If you had known that my family had influence, you would have listened to my ideas. That's exactly the problem. Professor, your respect shouldn't be conditional on someone's wealth or connections. It should be based on their humanity and their right to be treated with dignity. The truth of Marcus's words hit the lecture hall like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about one professor's prejudice. It was about an entire system that valued people based on their perceived status rather than their inherent worth. Professor Whitfield was now visibly sweating. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Please, Marcus, I mean, Mr. Johnson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply trying to maintain academic standards. Academic standards? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Professor, you accused me of academic dishonesty based solely on your assumption that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly produce quality research. You dismissed my ideas without even considering their merit. You turned this classroom into a hostile environment for me, and probably countless other students who don't fit your narrow definition of academic excellence. Marcus pulled out his phone again and began dialing. I think it's time my father learned about the kind of education his donations are supporting. Wait! Professor Whitfield practically shouted, his desperation now obvious to everyone in the room. Please, let's discuss this privately. There's no need to involve. I mean, perhaps we can work something out. But Marcus was already connecting the call. Hi, Dad, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent lecture hall. I'm sorry to bother you during your meeting, but I think you need to know about something that just happened in my economics class. Even though the other students couldn't hear both sides of the conversation, they could see Professor Whitfield's face growing paler with each word Marcus spoke. The professor was frantically gesturing, trying to signal Marcus to stop, but it was far too late for damage control. Yes, Dad, Professor Marcus Whitfield, Marcus said into the phone. He's been teaching here for 30 years. Yes, that's the same Professor Whitfield who's been mentioned in previous discrimination complaints. No, this wasn't subtle at all. He accused me of academic dishonesty and suggested that someone with my background couldn't possibly produce quality research. Professor Whitfield looked like he was about to faint. The mention of previous discrimination complaints had hit him like a physical blow because he knew exactly what Marcus was referring to. There had been other incidents over the years, other students who had filed complaints about his behavior, but his tenure and connections had always protected him, until now. Actually, Dad, Marcus continued, there are about 200 witnesses here now, and several students have been recording the whole thing. I think this might be exactly the kind of evidence the university needs to finally take action. The professor's legs seemed to give out, and he sank into his chair behind the lecture podium. The man who had stood so confidently just minutes before, dispensing insults and asserting his authority, now looked like a broken shell of his former self. Marcus ended the call and turned back to face Professor Whitfield. My father will be calling the university president within the next 10 minutes, he said calmly. He's also going to be reviewing all previous complaints against you, and he's very interested in understanding how someone with your track record has been allowed to continue teaching. The implications were clear, and Professor Whitfield understood them perfectly. David Johnson wasn't just any donor. He was the university's largest private contributor, and his influence extended far beyond his financial contributions. When someone of his stature raised concerns about faculty conduct, the university administration listened very carefully. Furthermore, Marcus continued, my father is going to be requesting a full investigation into the culture of discrimination in this department. He wants to understand how many other students have been subjected to the kind of treatment I experienced today. Professor Whitfield tried one last desperate appeal. Marcus, please, I have a family, a career. I've dedicated my life to this university, and I'm sure there are many students who have dedicated their lives to their education, only to have professors like you tear them down and make them feel like they don't belong. Marcus replied, the difference is, those students didn't have the resources to fight back. I do. The lecture hall remained silent as Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave, but before he reached the door, he turned back one final time to address his fellow students. I want everyone here to understand something, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room.
What happened today wasn't just about me. It was about every student who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Every person who has been judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. Every individual who has been told that their perspective doesn't matter. He paused, looking directly at Professor Whitfield. Then it was about the responsibility we all have to speak up when we witness injustice, regardless of whether we have the power to do something about it. With that, Marcus walked out of the lecture hall, leaving behind a professor whose career was about to end and 200 students who had just witnessed one of the most dramatic reversals of power in academic history. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within an hour of Marcus's phone call, David Johnson was sitting in the university president's office, demanding immediate action. The video recordings of Professor Whitfield's behavior had already begun circulating on social media, generating outrage and calls for accountability. By the end of the day, Professor Whitfield had been suspended pending a full investigation. The university, faced with overwhelming evidence of discriminatory behavior and the prospect of losing their largest donor, moved quickly to distance themselves from the professor's actions. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning Professor Whitfield's entire career. Dozens of former students came forward with similar stories of bias, harassment, and academic intimidation. The evidence was so overwhelming that even the professor's tenure couldn't protect him. 3 weeks later, Professor Marcus Whitfield was officially terminated from Harvard University. His dismissal sent shockwaves through the academic community and served as a warning to other faculty members who might be tempted to abuse their positions of power. But the story didn't end with Professor Whitfield's firing. David Johnson used the incident as a catalyst for broader change, establishing a new foundation dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion in higher education. He also created a scholarship program specifically designed to support students from underrepresented backgrounds who demonstrated academic excellence and leadership potential. Marcus, meanwhile, became something of a legend on campus. His courage in standing up to Professor Whitfield inspired other students to speak out about their own experiences with discrimination, leading to a broader conversation about bias in academia. The lecture hall where the confrontation took place was eventually renamed the Johnson Hall for Academic Excellence and Inclusion, serving as a permanent reminder that education should be a place where all students are valued and respected. Professor Whitfield, on the other hand, found himself unemployable in academia. The viral video of his behavior had made him toxic to potential employers, and his reputation was permanently destroyed. He eventually left the field of education entirely, a cautionary tale about the consequences of prejudice and abuse of power. Years later, when Marcus graduated summa cum laude and went on to earn his PhD in economics, he often reflected on that day in Professor Whitfield's classroom. It had been a turning point not just in his own life, but in the life of the university and countless other students who would benefit from the changes that followed. The research that Professor Whitfield had so dismissively attacked went on to be published in several prestigious economic journals and contributed to important policy discussions about inequality and economic justice. Marcus's work proved that excellence knows no boundaries and that the best ideas can come from the most unexpected places. But perhaps the most important lesson from that day was about the power of standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Marcus could have remained silent, could have accepted the professor's treatment and moved on with his life. Instead, he chose to use his privilege and resources to create change that would benefit others. The story of Marcus Johnson and Professor Whitfield became a case study in business schools and education programs across the country, illustrating the importance of diversity, inclusion, and ethical leadership. It showed that true power comes not from the ability to tear others down, but from the courage to lift them up. And it proved that sometimes the most arrogant people are the ones who have the most to learn about humility, respect, and the true meaning of education. What do you think about this incredible story of justice and transformation? Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their power only to face the consequences they deserved? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more amazing stories of people who stood up against injustice and changed the world around them. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories that remind us all of the power we have to create positive change in our communities and beyond. Remember, you never know who you're dealing with when you judge someone by their appearance. And sometimes the person you underestimate might just be the one who changes everything.